If human variation were to map along racial lines, people in one so-called race would be more similar to each other than to those in another so-called race. That's not what the students found in their mtDNA. What about other genetic differences?
You're different.
The problem for evolutionists and population geneticists was always to try to actually characterize how much genetic variation there was between individuals and groups. And I spent a lot of time worrying about that, like other people in my profession.
In the 1960s, Richard Lewington decided to find out just how much genetic variation fell within and how much between the groups we regard as races. A new technology enabled him to do pioneering work.
And that method, which is called gel electrophoresis, a very fancy name, we were able to use on any organism at all. If you could grind it up, you could do it. That included people. I mean, you don't have to grind the whole person, but you could take a little bit of tissue or blood. Over the years, a lot of data were gathered by anthropologists and geneticists looking at blood group genes and protein genes and other kinds of genes from all over the world. I mean, anthropologists just went around taking blood out of everybody. I must say, if I were a South American Indian, I wouldn't have let them take my blood, but they did. And so I thought, well, we've got enough of these data. Let's see what it tells us about the differences between human groups.
Lewington's findings were a milestone in the study of race and biology.
If you put it all together, and we've now got that for proteins, for blood groups, and now with DNA sequencing, we have it for DNA sequence differences, it always comes out the same. 85% of all the variation among human beings is between any two individuals within any local population. Between individuals within Sweden, or within the Chinese, or the Kikuyu, or the Icelanders.
To put it another way, of the small amount of variation in our genes, there is apt to be as much difference between Gorgeous and her teammate Christine as there is between Gorgeous and her opponent Kaylin. Any two individuals within any so-called race may be as different from each other as they are from any individual in another so-called race.
Are the people who we call black more like each other than they are like people who we call white, genetically speaking? The answer is no. There's as much or more diversity and genetic difference within any racial group as there is between people of different racial groups.
Still, we know that some genes are found with greater frequency in some populations.
And geography is the better way to explain that more than race or anything else. There can be accumulations of genes in one place in the globe and not another.
If genes contribute to Marcus's musical talent, there would be dozens, interacting with environment, training, and practice. Those genes would be inherited independently of the genes for eye shape, skin color, and hair form, which Marcus inherited through his Korean and Jamaican ancestors.
For race to be more than skin deep, one has to have concordance. In other words, skin color needs to reflect things that are deeper in the body under the skin. But most of human variation is non-concordant. Skin color or eye color or hair color is not correlated with height or weight. And they're definitely not correlated with more complex traits like intelligence or athletic performance.
Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
It's an untenable artificial world. You're creating a weird utopia in a way. A utopia of middle-class white people who were trying to deny that they were living in a multi-racial world. And how long can you keep that up? You can't keep that up forever. Whether there were going to be black people in Levittown was just, it would be almost the equivalent of saying, are there going to be Martians in Levittown?
Basically, the idea of whiteness is who's included, who's part of the family, and it has material consequences. Blacks weren't completely left out of the housing market. The housing market that they were exposed to was largely public housing. And public housing, first of all, was built almost exclusively, with a few exceptions, in the central city. And after World War II, we started building these larger and larger public housing projects, which were called vertical ghettos. All of a sudden, you're concentrating large numbers of poor people of color in one place.
Another federal program, urban renewal, was supposed to make cities more livable. 90% of all housing destroyed by urban renewal was not replaced. 2/3 of those displaced were black or Latino.
Fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
In 1968, President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act. For the first time, racial language was removed from federal housing policy.
When a neighborhood, a previously white neighborhood, starts to integrate, even if individual whites don't have personal or psychological animosity or racial hatred, they still have an economic incentive to leave because they recognize that others might make the same calculation and leave first. So you get a vicious circle where whites calculate that other whites are going to sell when a neighborhood integrates, therefore they want to sell first to avoid losses, and they actually make it happen. They make white flight happen.
And if you think about African Americans, if African Americans are 20% of that market, it means that 80% of the people are not looking in those places for homes. So the prices of those homes declines or stays stable. And banks contribute to this by continually making loans in regions that are on the rise, white communities, and making it difficult to get loans in black communities.
But when blacks are by themselves, they can't get loans, they don't have a decent tax base, there are no jobs, and then that becomes associated with black space. At one point, we had explicit laws that says whites are on top and blacks are on the bottom. Today, we have many of the same practices, without the explicit language. So many people are confused as why after 50 years of civil rights are our schools still segregated? Why are our housing markets still segregated? Why are our jobs still segregated? And again, a lot of this is a function of how we've reinscribed the racial geographic space in the United States. That structure is still what we're living with today.